Earlier, I pointed out that agriculture uses 80% of the world's fresh water, and it accounts for 70% of the contamination in our waterways. In getting to the point, agriculture is an environmental accident waiting to happen. Remember I mentioned about how our wastewater treatment plants do not take pharmaceuticals out of wastewater? In case you weren't aware, the #1 user of antibiotics and steroids is the pork, poultry, and beef industry. Dairy cows have to be washed before they are milked. It takes approximately 100 gallons of water to wash a cow, and nowadays cows are milked twice a day and some even 3 times a day. In taking a look at the environmental exposures impacting agriculture, some of these will be repetitive from the real estate developers and owners, and others will be new. Agricultural operations have environmental exposures such as storage, use, and disposal of fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and animal waste, disposal of liquid waste in septic or leach systems, storage of fuels, antifreeze, oil, and hydraulic fluids, releases from above ground and underground storage tanks, air emissions from chemical applications and animal waste, stormwater runoff, vapor intrusion. As I've said before, you'll hear me repeat items several times in the Environmental Strategist Certification training because these are major environmental exposures that can impact a wide variety of businesses such as stormwater runoff and vapor intrusion. Agricultural operations can have spills from loading and unloading of farm equipment and supplies, faulty refrigeration units. Refrigeration plays a major role in preserving agricultural products so they can use and store large quantities of refrigerants on site. Overuse of irrigation, on-site disposal of trash, garbage, and other waste materials. I visited a farm after a newly built school located adjacent to the farm was not able to find clean water for consumption. The groundwater contaminants came from a neighboring farm. However, none of the constituents in the contamination would be found in agricultural operations. This was a 4th-generation farm, and I asked who the oldest family member was I could talk to about some of the historical practices. The oldest person associated with the farm was not a family member, but a retired employee and a lifetime family friend. I can't remember his name, so let's call him Bob. Even though he was retired, Bob still came around the farm every day. It just so happened Bob came around while I was visiting, and we started to talk about some of the past practices and what type of raw materials they used in their operations. Even at 90, Bob remembers his time on the farm as though it were yesterday. Bob shared their operations and the different crops they grew over the years, even had some livestock until the village started to close in on them and people complained about the animal noise and smell. Still, nothing came up that matched the contaminants found in the neighboring groundwater. I asked Bob if any other operations ever took place on the property besides agriculture, like manufacturing or lumbering. Bob said no, it has always been agriculture, as far back as he can remember. He said he was there during the time of the Great Depression, and when he was just a youngster and his father was the farm foreman. Times were tight, and so in order to have presents at Christmas time, their great-grandpa decided to allow a local manufacturing company to bury some of their waste on the property. It turns out the waste buried more than 80 years ago was migrating onto the neighboring property, causing the groundwater contamination. Bob was able to take us right to the spot on the 1,200-acre farm where great-grandpa made his Christmas money. Historically, farms have been known to use their land to dispose of waste such as old pesticides or fertilizer barrels, household waste, and more. Oftentimes, these old practices are not discovered until a developer comes in to put in a foundation for their new real estate development, and the excavator exacerbates the problem by excavating through the pre-existing unknown waste that was not detected during the environmental due diligence process. Old equipment storage yards are common sites at agricultural operations, which over time can allow contaminants like fuel, oil, antifreeze, asbestos, lead, cadmium, hydraulic fluids to leach into the ground and contaminate the soil and groundwater, or get washed off to third-party properties via stormwater runoff. The majority of environmental losses do not just happen poof, all of a sudden accidental. No, most of them take place over a gradual period of time. A simple example I use is if you have a gas station, and let's say for sake of discussion purposes that 1 gallon of gasoline hits the ground each day. That means over a year there are 365 gallons in the ground, and over 10 years there would be 3,650 gallons of gasoline in the ground. You can have on-site compost piles, wastewater lagoons, or injection wells, land application of human septage from septic pumpers and haulers, and animal waste applications. Nothing like the smell of freshly applied animal waste to bring back memories of springtime. An interesting loss that occurred on a tropical island involved an elbow joint on the piping of a manure lagoon that broke, and 200,000 gallons of manure flowed into a nearby stream. The stream emptied into the ocean, but it is where it entered the ocean that was an interesting situation, because it went through the middle of a vacation resort, and the smell was so bad they had to relocate all of the resort guests to alternative lodging, and they filed a $2 million business interruption claim against the dairy farm. How about historical contamination, natural resource damages, old or abandoned wells not properly closed, allowing contamination into the soil and groundwater, improper management of protected or sensitive areas like wetlands, vandalism, easements on the property such as railroads, roadways, pipelines, power lines, cell towers, waterways with potential environmental implications, uncontained floor drains, in-ground sumps and pits, inadequate or no auditing of hazardous and non-hazardous waste handlers, spills and air emissions from emergency power generator systems, adverse reactions and interactions of chemical compounds that accidentally commingled during a fire, siltation of nearby streams from improper erosion control management, and more. So, agricultural operator, do you have any of these environmental exposures impacting your operations? By assisting the agricultural operator to have a better understanding of their environmental exposures, you can now strategize on allocating their environmental exposures. If we go to the second section of the ERA, reviewing environmental loss examples, number 1, during an unusually heavy rainstorm, the wall of a farm's on-site lagoon used to treat pig waste collapsed. More than 150,000 gallons of fecal waste flowed off-site onto neighboring properties and into a river. Waste cleanup costs exceeded $350,000, while third-party property damage claims exceeded $75,000. An environmental impairment liability policy could have covered them for this exposure. How about loss example number 2? A property owner had his drinking water well tested prior to selling his land. Testing revealed the well contained an alarmingly high concentration of total petroleum hydrocarbons. Further investigation revealed that the source of the contamination were several dozen drums of waste oil and maintenance fluids buried on a neighboring farm. Though the drums were buried by the previous farm owner, the current owner was nevertheless responsible for disposal of the drums and soil and groundwater cleanup, along with bodily injury and property damage claims submitted by the neighboring property owners. Total costs exceeded $1 million and caused the farmer's bankruptcy. Had this farmer negotiated in the buy-sell agreement when they bought the farm, no pun intended, environmental financial assurance, a property transfer policy could have covered this environmental exposure while avoiding a bankruptcy. On page 33, loss example number 3, a slaughterhouse disposed of its waste down a floor drain. The drain was connected to a storm sewer drain that led directly to a nearby stream. A fish kill occurred as a result of high biological oxygen demand in the stream. Under the Clean Water Act, CWA, a local environmental group filed suit for loss of the stream. The slaughterhouse spent $750,000 remediating the problem. An environmental impairment liability policy could have covered the slaughterhouse for this loss. Slaughterhouses have to keep their product cool, so they store and use large quantities of refrigerants. Loss example number 5. Over a period of several years, stormwater from a chicken processing plant entered a nearby stream and lake. Due to excessive algae and bacteria in the lake, nearby residents and businesses filed claims that exceeded $2 million for property damage, loss of enjoyment, and perceived bodily injury. The word perceived is what catches my attention here, because I can't tell you how many environmental losses I have read where complainants are getting awarded monies for perceived damages, not actual damages. A good example is asbestos. Juries are awarding damages to complainants that have no signs of asbestos damage, but because they were exposed to it, it is therefore perceived they will be impacted, and therefore they are awarded damages. Environmental impairment liability coverage could have covered this loss. In taking a look at Section 3 on page 34 of the ERA, we will see some of the environmental insurance coverages agricultural operations could consider when looking to transfer their environmental exposures. As with all of the Environmental Strategist ERAs, Section 3 begins by highlighting the three main benefits environmental liability insurance offers. First, defense coverage. Secondly, claim management and coverage for third-party bodily injury, property damage, and business interruption. On page 35, we start discussing environmental impairment liability coverage. Agricultural businesses can own, rent, or lease land, and they can have multiple locations, and we can blanket all of those locations onto one policy so they will share the limits and the premium. Property transfer coverage, obviously farms are bought and sold on a regular basis. The need for this coverage we have discussed, and anyone buying or selling agricultural property as part of a solid environmental risk management strategy needs to make sure financial assurances are in place to meet the environmental indemnification in the buy-sell agreement. Transportation coverage is a big exposure for agricultural operations. How do they receive their raw materials? How do they move them around on their agricultural properties? And how are their finished products moved to the market? We have a loss example where a dairy farm was transporting milk to the processor and en route was in an accident, and their load spilled into a stream and depleted oxygen in the stream, causing an aquatic wildlife die-off. When they filed a claim with their insurance carrier, the carrier denied coverage, saying the milk was a pollutant. The need for a transportation financial assurance strategy is clear and evident. How are they buying their raw materials? FOB point of shipment or FOB point of delivery? Underground above-ground storage tanks on page 36. One exposure often overlooked with above-ground storage tanks is that on farms they move them around their property, and what happens is a rainstorm will make the ground below the tank unstable and it tips and spills the contents. Page 36 talks about environmental exposures from vendors such as the contractors you hire to do chemical applications, wastewater treatment and land application, refrigeration, and much more. And if they cause an environmental loss or exacerbating an existing environmental liability, contractors' pollution liability insurance can cover this exposure. Who are you doing business with? Ag operations need to make sure the engineers they hire to do water testing and site assessments have the proper professional liability insurance in force, since standard commercial general liability policies will typically exclude this coverage.